Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled 2018, one of the least extreme years on record. The press is full of hysterical stories like these ones. Extreme weather, a wake-up call, experts. 2018, a tipping point for climate change. 2018, a year of deadly climate disasters and an ear-splitting wake-up call. And I love this story at the bottom. A Labour government in Britain would radically transform economy to focus on climate change. Now let's look at the difference between the rhetoric of the press and climate scientists and what's going on in the real world. On the day after Christmas, the Washington Post reported that 2018 was the first year with no violent EF4 or EF5 tornadoes in the United States. I wouldn't describe a record low number of violent tornadoes as being extreme weather, unless you're talking about extremely mild weather. This next graph shows the percent of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit in the United States every year since 1895. And you can see that this year was very low. There was a very low number of hot days, well below average and one of the lowest on record. Additionally, note that there's been a sharp downwards trend in the frequency of hot days in the United States over the last century. So hot days are down in the United States. What about cold nights? Well, they're also decreasing. The percent of nights below 0 degrees Fahrenheit has dropped sharply since the 19th century. There was some very cold weather early in the year in the Midwest and the eastern United States, but for the entire year, the percent of nights below 0 degrees Fahrenheit was below average. So the number of cold days and hot nights was below average in the United States last year, and this graph is really interesting. This is the difference between the average daily maximum and the average daily minimum in the United States, and last year was the lowest on record. We had the least extreme temperatures on record in the United States last year. That doesn't sound like a wake-up call to me. That sounds like sleep in for another hour. The California forest fires were a big story, of course, last year, and that's one of the main sources of the alarm. But if we look at U.S. forest fire burn acreage, we can see that it's way down since the 1930s, and that last year was well below average, too. Here's an interesting article about forest fires from the New York Times in 1992. Scientists have discovered that major conflagrations of fire sweeping across many mountain ranges in California and the Southwest were a long and common feature occurring at least twice a decade and apparently linked to oceanic currents much further south. So California has always had huge fires, and they're due to oceanic currents. Quite a different story from what we hear from climate alarmists today. Here's another story from the New York Times from 25 years ago. Severe ancient droughts, a warning to California. Beginning about 1100 years ago, what is now California baked in two droughts, the first lasting 220 years and the second 140 years. Each was more intense than the mere 6-year dry spells that afflict modern California from time to time, new studies of past climates show. The findings suggest, in fact, that the relatively wet periods like the 20th century have been the exception rather than the rule in California for the last 3,500 years, and that mega droughts are likely to recur. The 20th century was the wettest century in California, and that's when everybody moved there, and they thought that was the normal climate. In fact, the normal climate of California is drought, and most of the people who moved there to get out of the rain. Then they're surprised that it's dry when they get there. I annotated this graph from the Mercury News to show just how ridiculous beliefs about California drought are. These red humps represent the multi-century droughts which the New York Times article was discussing. The blue regions represent wet times, and you can see that the 20th century was very wet, the wettest century on record. The recent drought has been relatively minor compared to past droughts. They didn't have a lot of sport utility vehicles in California 1,000 years ago when these massive droughts occurred. Blaming humans is pretty ridiculous. There weren't a lot of sport utility vehicles in California either in 1936, when this was the lead story in the Santa Cruz News. Forest fires occurring in Santa Cruz Mountains for a century, seen as greatest peril to future prosperity. Data compiled by State Forestry Department show county visited by flames almost yearly since Big Fire of 1868, which ran over forested summits from Watershed of the Pescadero Peaks to the Gavilands. I used to live there, and that's a huge area. In January of last year, the New York Times warned that poor forest management in California threatened them with massive forest fires. California forests are much more vulnerable now because paradoxically they've been better protected. In their natural state, forests were regularly thinned by fires, but the billions of dollars that the state spends fighting wildfires and restrictions on logging have allowed forests to accumulate an overload of vegetation. The same problem has occurred all over the West. I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where they had huge forest fires from 1977 until 2010. These fires were the result of many years of Smokey the Bear management, where we were putting fires out. Well, pine forests need the fire, and if we don't allow them to occur naturally, we tend to get very large fires later rather than small fires in the present. President Trump agreed with the New York Times article blaming the forest fires in California on poor forest management. And of course, as soon as President Trump said the same thing they did, the New York Times changed their story. As their former editor stated yesterday, Trump derangement syndrome runs deep at the New York Times. There's actually very little drought in the United States right now. This is today's U.S. Drought Monitor map, which actually has some pretty serious problems that I'm going to show you now. Generally, the idea is that there isn't a lot of extreme drought outside of the Four Corners area. But I was just in the Four Corners area, and they're buried in snow. This was me in Los Alamos, New Mexico a few days ago. As you can see, there was a lot of snow, and since I was there, they got a lot more. This is another picture I took before the really big snow. The Los Alamos ski area has received more than 5 feet of snow in the last 7 days, and more than 8 feet of snow this winter already. And the U.S. Drought Monitor lists them as being in extreme drought. This is what U.S. drought looked like in December, the year before I was born. Huge areas of drought covering the entire state of New Mexico, almost all of Texas, and many other states in the West. The reason why the Southwest is a desert is because precipitation is not reliable there. They go through long periods with very little precipitation, and then people get hysterical and they blame it on climate change. Besides the California forest fires, the big climate story last year was hurricanes. We had a couple big major hurricanes that did a lot of damage. But actually, U.S. landfalling hurricanes peaked in 1886 and generally have been declining ever since. And last year we had just about an average number of hurricanes since Abraham Lincoln was president. During the year 1886, when Grover Cleveland was president, Texas was hit by 4 hurricanes and Florida was hit by 3 hurricanes. Could you imagine the hysteria if that happened now? Last year we had 2. The number of hurricanes hitting the United States is sharply down since the 19th century. What about major hurricanes? We had 2 major hurricanes each of the last 2 years, but prior to that was the longest spell on record with no major hurricanes in the United States. If we look at the frequency of major hurricanes, we can see that they peaked in the 1940s and that they were a record low a couple of years ago. Major hurricanes always do a lot of damage, and cable news likes to show pictures of them and claim that they're due to climate. But this was Galveston, Texas in the year 1900 after they got destroyed by a storm surge from a major Category 4 hurricane. 10,000 people were killed by that storm in 1900, and they had to completely rebuild the city after. The U.S. has had many catastrophic major hurricanes over the years. In 1926, Miami was destroyed by a hurricane. We've had many, many others. The ones last year were of course bad, but they weren't any worse than many we've had in the past. The Red Cross described 1927 as the worst year in their history, with 111 disasters, including 29 tornadoes, 24 floods, 9 hurricanes, and 23 fires. The Mississippi River in 1927 was flooded for more than 6 months for hundreds and hundreds of miles, and hundreds of thousands of people moved away permanently, moved up to northern cities. Vermont had their worst flood in history in 1927 on the Winooski River. The flood destroyed more than 1,000 bridges. I used to cross the Winooski River on my way to work in Burlington, Vermont, and was very familiar with some of the scenes of this catastrophe. And also in 1927, St. Louis was largely destroyed by a tornado. Now let's compare 1927 to 2018, which was the first year with no violent tornadoes in the United States. Not exactly a wake-up call. 2018 was a record low year for violent tornadoes. It was a very low year for extreme heat. Forest fire burn acreage was well below the long-term average. Droughts in the United States in 2018 were nothing unusual and were probably below average. The U.S. did have a couple of bad major hurricanes last year, but that's happened many times in the past. And right before that was the longest period on record, 11 years with no major hurricanes in the United States. I think people might have forgotten what the normal actually is. President Reagan said, "The trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't so." I agree with him except for the fact that they genuinely are ignorant about climate. They conflate normal weather events with climate and get hysterical about it. The reality is that 2018 was one of the least extreme weather years on record in the United States. We had a record low number of violent tornadoes, 0. We had a very low number of hot afternoons. The average daily temperature range was the lowest on record. That's the exact opposite of extreme weather. The drought area of the United States was well below average last year, and forest fire burn acreage was also below average. The only wake-up call I see is it's time to put an end to this climate hysteria before it does some serious damage. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.